The first part of this talk focused mainly on showing why the concept of leadership, which is the very heart of how society is organized, is a corrupt and evil construct. The next important thing to learn is that there has always been an alternative to leadership, a much better alternative. Proof, I hear you cry, and quite rightly so. Well, I've already shown the myth of leadership from my own personal experience as a team leader in the civil service. That was not an insignificant example, because the leader-based model of organisation used in the public services is very similar to the leader-based model of organisation used in nearly all big organisations all over the world. I showed that leadership was not only irrelevant to the way my own team worked, it was actually a worse way of organising it. So it therefore follows that the leaderless system I introduced for the organisation of my own team would obviously be an infinitely better way of running nearly all government departments and large organisations. If it worked for my team, and it most definitely did, why not almost every other team too? Now, far from being something original and radical, there was actually nothing new and revolutionary about what I did. Plenty of other leaderless organisations have existed in the past, and exist to this day. And, when they've been allowed to develop, they've invariably done very well. We never hear very much about them, not because they don't work, but because the great trusted leaders who run our planet don't want people to find out that great trusted leaders aren't actually necessary. There's an expression for this. It's called the threat of a good example. And all our fine trusted leaders have been terrified of it for hundreds of years, at least. Take, for example, the Diggers. The Diggers were one of the quite numerous groups of levellers who emerged out of the chaos left behind after the British Civil War in the 17th century. The Diggers organised themselves according to the principles of the best known of their number, Gerard Winstanley. These principles were essentially anti-authoritarian and egalitarian. Digger communities worked perfectly well for the brief moment in history when they were left alone, but once it became apparent their good example was a serious threat to the authority and wealth of the powerful leaders of the day, they were exterminated. Small communal organisations have often been tolerated all around the world, and are nearly always successful if left alone. Today, for example, we see the highly successful kibbutz movement that thrives in that otherwise execrable little country known as Israel, and has done so for several decades. Or there's the highly successful Mondragon organisation based in Spain. There are many highly successful worker cooperatives in other countries too, including the United States of all places. And Argentina, which is a country that was severely blighted by the ruthless economic policies of the 1% throughout much of the 20th century. The book Sin Patron is about the experiences of many different groups of Argentinian workers who, betrayed by the great trusted leaders who once employed them, occupied the factories those trusted leaders had looted and shut down, and, using leaderless models of organisation, the workers brought them back to profitable life once again. So we know for a fact that leaderless organisation has been around for at least 3.5 centuries, since the time of Winstanley's Diggers, and we know for a fact that they invariably do very well if left alone to get on with their work. Leaderless organisation is a core principle of anarchism, which is probably as old as human civilization itself, and it was anarchists who provided the most well-known example of the success of leaderless organisation, as any student of the Spanish Civil War could confirm. For during that war, it was the anarchists who took on the might of the fascist Spanish army, and they could well have won, were it not for the fact that the great leaders of powerful Western countries, such as Britain, America, Italy, and Germany, all chose to support an unelected fascist regime rather than those who were fighting for the legitimate elected government of Spain. A policy which was then, and still remains today, a familiar posture of the great trusted leaders of Western governments. That stands to reason when you think about it, for the very last thing these great trusted leaders want is the threat of good examples of societies based wholly on leaderless organisation. So there's absolutely no doubt that leaderless models of society are not only possible, they're far superior to models controlled by corrupt and self-interested leaders. In future talks, where I'll discuss one such possible model, the People's Constitution, I'll go into far more detail about how exactly this could be achieved. For now, it might help to consider the fine words of Eugene Debs, an American socialist who stood for election to the US presidency on 5 occasions, the last of which was from a prison cell. Although Debs tried 5 times to be elected to one of the most powerful leaderships on the planet, here's what he thought about the principle of leadership itself. I quote, "I never had much faith in leaders. I am willing to be charged with almost anything rather than to be charged with being a leader. I am suspicious of leaders, and especially of the intellectual variety. Give me the rank and file every day of the week. If you go to the city of Washington and you examine the pages of the Congressional Directory, you will find that almost all of these corporation lawyers and cowardly politicians, members of Congress and misrepresentatives of the masses, you will find that almost all of them claim, in glowing terms, that they have risen from the ranks to places of eminence and distinction. I am very glad I cannot make that claim for myself. I would be ashamed to admit that I had risen from the ranks. When I rise, it will be with the ranks and not from the ranks. I am not a Labour leader. I don't want you to follow me or anyone else. If you are looking for a Moses to lead you out of the capitalist wilderness, you will stay right where you are. I would not lead you into this promised land even if I could, because if I could lead you in, someone else could lead you out." You can see why the US establishment was never going to allow Debs to come to power. So let's move on now and consider leaderless organisation in a little more detail. Now, if we take any group of people living or working together for some common purpose, one of the most important functions of that group is decision making. If any group is going to be effective, their efforts must be coordinated. Deciding what those efforts should be, who should do them, and by when, is all the business of decision making. In systems that use leaders, that's very simple, though not necessarily good. The leader makes the decisions. But what about groups that don't have leaders? Well, the process is just as easy. In fact, it's so easy that even small children can do it. Take Summerhill School in Suffolk, for example. Summerhill has been around and thriving for about 100 years. It's a very unique type of school where nearly all decision-making is made by all of the children who attend the school. In other words, kids effectively run the place. There's also the usual complement of adults with specialist functions, such as teaching and doing essential administration and maintenance. But none of these adults has any more decision-making authority than the smallest child there. The routine of decision-making usually takes place once a week at meetings which all children and adults are free to attend, and where anyone may speak up and express an opinion. Decisions are made by voting, and everyone, children and adults alike, have the same right to vote, and each vote counts just the same. Given that there are far more children than adults, it's clear to see that the children can overrule any proposal made by an adult, if the children disagree with it. Far from being a recipe for disaster, Summerhill has been going for many years and regularly produces fine young people whose standards of education is at least comparable with children from more conventional schools. And in addition to that, these children have learned firsthand respect for others, equality, real democracy in action, and many other benefits of leaderless organisation. The method of decision-making used at Summerhill is not difficult. Any group of people can do exactly the same, no matter the size of the group. If we examine the model and inspect the main components, we find the following. First of all, and crucially, there's good information, followed by free and open discussion about that information, and then a vote is taken by everyone affected by that information about what should be done. Let's look at each of these stages in a little bit more detail. Good information. Vital to all good decision-making, whether by dictator or democrat, is good and reliable information. And reliable information must always comprise a negative argument, a dissenting voice pointing out possible problems and pitfalls, or, at the very least, a voice that wonders what the problems and pitfalls might be. Very few dictators or supposedly strong leaders tolerate dissenting voices. Those who show negativity, because to listen to those voices is seen as a sign of weakness. Real democrats, on the other hand, know that counter-arguments are essential for good decision-making and actively seek out those who can provide them. Real democrats know that informed opinion does not require dozens of supposed experts all obediently repeating the party line for fear of blighting their careers or losing their jobs or their lives. Good informed opinion can be achieved by listening carefully to just two experts who disagree with each other. This point is so very important that it would be useful to take a little time to expand on it. Our so-called democracies have developed the process of debate into a fine art. Part of how they do this is by manipulation and marketing of expert opinion to create the illusion of informed debate. Not unlike the illusion of democracy our trusted leaders create, or the illusion of their so-called free markets, or the illusion of their free press. Experts are powerful voices in any debate concerning their specialist subjects. But for a proper debate to be truly effective, however, it's essential to ensure that for every expert voice that holds one particular position, there's also at least one dissenting expert voice that holds a totally different position. However, there's a major problem, because simply presenting two experts who appear to disagree with each other does not itself guarantee the discovery of truth or the production of a good decision. It's very easy to find two experts who disagree with each other, yet who are both wrong. Take religion, for just one very obvious example. You could have an expert in Christianity, say, and an expert in Islam, say, debating the authentic word of God. They would no doubt disagree over all manner of things, but who's to say which of them is right, if either, as experts in Hinduism, say, or Buddhism, would no doubt claim. Today, the average so-called expert is typically someone with a university degree and who also probably works for some prestigious organization. Many of today's leading opinion formers are strident advocates of expert testimony. Now, there's nothing wrong with listening to experts, and I do it myself all the time, but it must never be forgotten that many of these so-called experts are frequently wrong. For example, there were countless economic experts who presided over the destruction of the world's economy, and no doubt they could all paper the walls of their Mayfair and Manhattan mansions with university degrees. But that didn't stop any of them from plunging the world's taxpayers into a debt that their children will still be paying off a generation and more into the future. Although many of these particular experts probably knew very well the world economy was about to come crashing around our ears, they also knew it wasn't in their own best interests to say so. The problem of expert testimony in government is incredibly serious. Our so-called democracies present for our entertainment the spectacle of political parties who supposedly disagree with each other, and indeed nearly all of these so-called experts in government can put on very convincing shows of disagreement. However, the desperately serious problem is that very few of them really disagree at all. Western governments are completely dominated by right-wing ideology, where all the real decision-making is done by very powerful, unaccountable individuals working in secret behind closed doors. The disagreeing experts who appear in public for our entertainment, in the form of elected politicians or their flunkies, only disagree within a very narrow spectrum of right-wingness, and that only for show. To create the illusion of open debate, where virtually no left-wing or humane opinion is tolerated at all. And as I said, the decisions are fixed long before the first public exchanges even take place. Noam Chomsky uses the illusion of consumer choice to explain the trick. And I quote, "Consumers make choices, no doubt, as voters do, within a narrowly determined framework of options, designed by those who own the society and manage it with their own interests in mind." Note those words, within a narrowly defined framework of options, because that goes to the very heart of the trick. In other words, there is the illusion of choice, but in actual fact, the choices presented are carefully controlled so that whatever the outcome, it will be an outcome the controllers want. It was the sort of thing that Henry Ford famously exemplified when he said that buyers of his cars could have any colour they liked, so long as it was black. Our system of government works on an identical principle. The main political parties are controlled by a sinister and corrupt economic system, so that come election time there is always the appearance of choice. But no matter which party wins, the controllers remain exactly the same and unaffected by the outcome. The puppets change all the time, but the puppeteers live on. Election after election. The most blatant example of this was when the Blair government came to power in 1997. The electorate, sick to the heart of almost 2 decades of Tory economics, elected Blair in the sincere belief he would reform things. But of course he didn't. In fact, he and his sidekick Gordon Brown made things even worse. The Tories had disappeared temporarily from the stage, but the play was the same old, same old.